Hey! Take your talking to the porch if you're gonna talk over lecture time. Also, we got seating of various kinds. If you're adventurous, you can sit on the quilt. Or if you're not worried about back problems, if anybody does have back problems or is pregnant or whatever, then they shouldn't have to sit there. They should sit on a chair or a couch, whatever's comfortable for them. But that's there for people if they want it.
I can sit for me. Come on.
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty empowering. Hi, Josie. Yes.
All right, so my introducer this year is a good friend of mine, A. Thomas Goodyear.
And you're my introducer too.
Yeah, effectively, it's a whole yin-yang situation we got going here.
Well, Peter had to call attention because he's a lot louder than I am.
Yeah, it's true. So everybody got to be quiet and let Aaron talk.
Yeah. Peter, yeah. I haven't prepared my remarks. I don't think I really need to. I've known Peter since college. We're about the same age. He's only about 2 weeks older than me.
Yep.
We're sort of like twins in a lot of ways.
Yes.
We're very similar. We both worship the devil.
Guilty.
Yeah, there was a Satan worshipping club at our school. We saw a lot of each other's nude bodies as we made sacrifices in blood.
This is all being recorded.
I know.
And so, yeah, we know a lot about each other. There's a lot of secrets you have to share in that kind of community. But, we've also had each other's backs. We've learned a lot from each other. We've learned a lot about each other. And Peter, he's a power of nature. Specifically, his power is heart. He does not have the power to whip up tornadoes or floods or anything like that. Only to
God knows I've tried.
To stir the hearts towards or against him. And you know what? I don't know exactly what he's going to be talking to you about. He gave me the speech. I only skimmed it because I didn't have a lot of time. But I bet it's going to be extraordinarily powerful, as is everything he does. So I hope that suffices as an introduction because I'm handing it over to him now. So,
all right.
Peter Garage.
In early May this year, there was an interesting internet dust-up, which, among other... sorry, hold on, I'm going to restart this. A few people I want to shout out to from the podium. Sarah, who drove to get all this stuff, which it would have been very difficult to get otherwise. So, big shout out to Sarah. Mufasa and Boz and Aaron helped cook all these things in front of you in varying degrees of varying of the things and various of the things that haven't been brought out yet, so they're mysteries. So yeah, obviously Aaron, my introducer, who really has had my back for a long time, despite being a man of great decency and common sense and basic simple goodness, has been friends with me for a long time. He is a man that I straight up love, and that's what it comes down to. And also just, I guess my parents for having had me and raised me to this point. And, all of you obviously coming out for what amounts to just a giant celebration of my ego. Thanks for that. Alright, now I'll actually begin. In early May this year, there was an interesting internet dust-up, which, among other notable attributes, featured what has to be the first time one of my alma maters, in this instance the New School, was discussed in Us Weekly, even if it was only the blog. What happened was this. During a panel discussion held at the school on the subject of black feminism, noted transgender activist Janet Mock expressed her admiration for pop superstar Beyonce. This led prominent feminist scholar and panel co-member Bell Hooks to denounce Beyoncé for her cooperation with the juncture between capitalist media production and sexist and racist beauty norms. Hooks, a past master of using pithy and provocative language to get her points across, capped off by calling the performer a terrorist for the harm which she allegedly visited upon the psyches of black girls. Sort of puts a new spin on the saw about one man's terrorist being another man's freedom fighter. I'm not going to go into the veracity of Hooks's claim here, both because it strikes me as pointless to do so, and because a discussion of the claim quickly became a discussion of the discussion, as internet arguments often do. A generational rift quickly became apparent. Younger commentators, based on the cornucopia of blogs dedicated to parsing the intersections between politics and pop culture, did not so much defend Beyoncé herself, though expressions of enjoyment for her music and respect for her business acumen abounded. Instead, they criticized her critics, like Hooks, mostly older commentators on race and culture, for singling Beyoncé out and for promulgating the supposedly joyless, lifeless politics of austere political combat. Nobody, as I saw, looking through the records of the discussion, actually trotted out the old Emma Goldman line about it not being her revolution if there was no dancing, but the spirit was there. Unlike many internet foofaras at royally effervescent waters of social justice discourse, the great Beyoncé terrorist dust-up ended quickly, and was relatively free of acrimony. Some of the main discussants even came to agree with each other publicly, a welcome and rare sight. In short, the reason why it struck me as worth noting doesn't have to do with its particular acrimony or whatever, but it has to do with the intergenerational quality that I mentioned. In short, it was funny to me that these younger social justice bloggers were attacking Hooks for opposing the valorization of a pop culture figure, when Hooks herself is a key figure in the rise of culture studies, the field which made pop culture a subject of sustained and key here, sympathetic critical inquiry. Unlike earlier academic critics of pop who emphasized the potential for their subject to stultify or even control masses of people otherwise alienated by modernity, the culture studies cohort of the 80s and 90s, Hooks prominent among them, made much of the subversive capabilities of people's interaction with and creation of popular media. Right? They thought of it as a potential liberatory tool, a potential subversive tool, whereas earlier critics did not. Selfhood, understood as an ongoing act of creative performance, which, if consciously undertaken, could subvert racial, gender, etc. hierarchies, was and is an idea that animates culture studies, and Hooks has written numerous works along these themes. Many of the untold number of think pieces on Beyoncé that one can find on the internet, and there's a great many, before and after the Hooks dust-up, use the pop star as an illustration of a black woman in control of her own performance of self, using ideas clearly borrowed from Hooks's wheelhouse, if not necessarily citing Hooks's work itself. So it was interesting to me to watch the older generation of culture studies visibly lose control of their central idea. And it was also interesting to see younger commentators in the same vein express their incredulity at one of the major figures of their intellectual tradition. It was sort of an Ouroboros moment, right? The serpent of culture studies eating its own tail. Indeed, one of the ways in which Hooks's critics paid her homage was in the rhetorical method they used in their attacks on Hooks and Hooks's defenders. While the Beyoncé terrorist claim is, on a literal level, incorrect enough, the critical bloggers typically did not take the time to point out the claim's outlandishness. For the most part, the critics argued less that Hooks and her defenders were wrong per se, but that they were harmful. By making their arguments, Hooks and her defenders, according to these critics, were oppressing the critics, and at least some of the critics' readership. They were acting to divert attention from more serious problems. They were reenacting sexist rhetorical practices. More than being factually wrong, Hooks was made out to be morally, perhaps existentially wrong. In Hooks' own writings, at least those I've sampled, she's had a long and productive career and has written a great deal. Her own criticism often follows the same lines. People are not merely wrong or incorrect in her world. Even people with whom she is with people with whom she is quite sympathetic. They're party to racism, sexism, to oppression in general. They are the problem which Hooks sees as her job to solve. Look at the internet, and you will see that, despite the presence of a great many nerds and pedants who make the showing up of factual errors a sort of sport, Hooks, no matter how much she may alienate some of her intellectual progeny, is assured for the time being that her legacy will live on. Her practice of treating many, most, perhaps all disagreements as manifestations of deep problems, which are at once civilizational-wide and profoundly damnably personal, is quite widespread in what we could call, for lack of a better word, the social justice community, which is not restricted to the internet, but which makes some of its more spectacular displays there. The arguments that take place in this conceptual space are part of an ongoing effort to define the relationship between individuals, communities, and moral and ethical imperatives in the context of two overwhelming shadows that loom over our time. The first shadow is the persistence of brutal, deadly social inequality, especially those along racial and gendered lines. The second is the failure of the left, especially after its high point of prominence in the 1960s, to follow through on its promises of social transformation and its subsequent long decline. The necessity of hard choices on the part of those committed to social justice in a period of conservative ascendancy, and the choices of those attempting to manage the consequences of social change, together between them condition much of the social justice discourse we see today, for better or for worse. A brief note on method. Dealing with the history of ideas forces a historian not to forego value judgments as such, but to look askance at normative explanations for why ideas are adapted or not. It's useless to say that a given idea took hold because it was right or good. People always think that the ideas they hold, people always happen to think that about the ideas they happen to hold. Historians need to know why and how they came to think their ideas were good. So I will be dealing with many ideas and practices here, good, bad, and indifferent, and while usually I have ideas about their values, that isn't a major part of the story I'd like to tell. Normative judgments can be a use of history, but normative explanations are just shoddy work. So, hard though it is, not to lean on such a shining beacon of moral judgment such as myself, don't. The collapse of the broad left that emerged through the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 60s coincided with the beginnings of civil society's efforts to piece together a response to the imperatives of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While massive resistance to the law gets more attention, rightly so probably, efforts to comply with the statute evince a pattern we'll see repeated a few times during the course of this lecture. The Civil Rights Act was very clear in its basic intent, the destruction of formal structures of racial discrimination. But it was quite vague in terms of how it meant to bring its imperatives about. Particularly challenging was Title VII, which contained those two fateful words, affirmative action. The phrase affirmative action conjures up for many images of government diktats from on high, specifying the racial order hither and yon across the land, but this image is patently false. The affirmative action stipulation in the Civil Rights Act says pretty much nothing about what affirmative action actually is. It just says it needs to happen. Any smart lawyer would be able to recognize that this is a golden opportunity for interested parties seeking to define a given legal space. As it happens, the interested parties that came to define what constitutes compliance with the mandate to take affirmative action to end discrimination were professionals in the field of human resources and personnel management. A field originally dedicated largely to preventing or defusing labor organization now found itself in a position to define corporate responses to affirmative action mandates. Logically enough, the process began in the companies most dependent on federal largesse, notably major defense contractors. What HR professionals were able to convince these companies, not run by the liberally inclined by and large, was that it would be much cheaper in the long run to implement programs to monitor, and in the company's own time, correct racial discrimination hiring practices than it would be to expose the firm to lawsuits through dilly-dallying. Together, HR people from a number of major corporations defined, piece by piece in a process still ongoing, best practices of anti-discrimination policy. These practices, in turn, were adopted by the courts, in absence of a more specific guidance from the federal government, as standards for compliance industry-wide, which other companies would be expected to meet or face potential legal action. The record gives us little on who exactly these HR professionals were, what their stances were on the social justice issues of the day, though we know, like many corporate support professionals, they lamented the tardiness of higher managers to see their work as essential. And, as is definitional to any profession, HR people are produced, as it were, institutionally, by programs in colleges and universities and kept up to speed by professional journals, associations, conventions, and so on. And so, the human resources professionals who would continue to negotiate the implications of civil rights law for corporations and other big institutions like schools, and translate the results of these negotiations into policy, were produced by institutions which were themselves sites of conflict over the legacy of the civil rights movement, its decline, and its offshoots. Academic history is starting to prod in its ginger, self-conscious way into the history of the 1970s and 1980s. The history of ideas is typically a bit easier to find sources for than other kinds of history, due to one of the subfield's major defects: its focus on people with the time, education, platform to make their ideas known to the world. And so the history of ideas has been making quicker inroads into the relatively recent past and other subfields, which is useful to us as that's the time that concerns us here. The big conversation piece in recent intellectual history these days is a book by Daniel Rogers, who teaches over at Princeton, called Age of Fracture. While the book as a whole is well worth reading, a lot of the argument is right there in the title. The period roughly from Watergate to 9/11, Rogers argues, was a time where broadly shared consensus ideas about society in America fractured. And the fractures of those fractures fractured further until we were afflicted with what he calls a contagion of metaphors. Now, I have a number of criticisms of this thesis as an explanatory rubric for American history in this period, but it appears to be an adequate description of the life of the mind in higher education in the 70s and 80s, the time Rogers started teaching, notably enough. At one point, before the upheavals of the 60s, the big American research university was actually held up by some as a model not just for higher education, but for society as a whole. Progressive but orderly, hierarchical in a meritocratic way, moving everyone along serenely towards the same, better future. But by the time the 70s came around, universities were in an odd and conflicted place, having digested perhaps more of the changes of the times than much of society, relaxed codes of conduct, ethnic studies departments, enshrinement of the right to protest, while not quite knowing what to do with themselves in the new dispensation. This, combined perhaps with the anxiety of shrinking prestige, gave academic politics of the time a nervous edginess and tendency to fracture that it never quite lost. It's common for leftists to bemoan some of the fracture points and divisions that arose among leftists and liberals in the 70s, and understandably so. But they came about as a product of real failures of the 60s left. During the 60s, black groups began to emphasize the necessity of autonomous, self-generated black organizations if black power was going to be anything other than a slogan, and other groups followed suit. Discontent with both black and white leftist organizations, which from all accounts were profoundly and often openly sexist, in turn fueled a resurgent women's movement, which reached similar conclusions about group autonomy. This in turn fractured along lines of race, class, and sexuality, along with differences about ideas and strategy. One good thing about the decline of the 60s left, from one perspective, is the plethora of different voices and perspectives it encouraged, in no small part in reaction to its failures. It was much like the last Batman movie in that respect. For all their differences, these movements and other successors of the 60s moment had a few important structural elements in common. First, terrain. No one, other than the fever dreams of the far corners of the renascent right, thought that the new movements were really going to overthrow the ruling class to court, as the new left, quite grandiosely, thought might or at any rate should happen. The movements were somewhat less marginalized, though, in colleges and universities, though it's very common to overstate their influence, especially as far as administrative decision-making is concerned, even there. Still, it provided a secure perch from which to spread their messages, even if it was largely spreading it to sleepy undergrads. Second, the post-60s left attempted, and to a great degree succeeded eventually, in turning public attention to politics understood on a smaller scale than the big doings on which the 60s left focused. The politics of domestic life, of small groups, of the local, the psychological, the personal, however defined. These weren't the sole focus of the post-60s left, but in many respects, the attention we pay to them is in part their doing. I tend to think that there are a few other things at work too, but that's a lecture for another day. I think it's fair to say that it was the effervescence of feminist writings, especially in the 70s and 80s, that did much of the work in illuminating this terrain for us. Given their involvement in earlier movements, whose critique of social structures tended to at best underplay and at worst denigrate women's issues, and having witnessed the dark side of a revolution, sexual mores, which did not place much emphasis on consent, feminists had and have a target-rich environment in front of them. And, Unlike the 60s New Left movements in which many 70s feminists once toiled, the latter proved quite comfortable using the legal means of the systems it critiqued. This turned out to be especially important for the human resources profession's ongoing negotiation with social change. The civil rights legislation upon which much of affirmative action is predicated includes sex as a category of discrimination as a result of what amounts to sabotage. A Southern congressman who opposed the extension of civil rights protection to blacks added sex to the list of things forbidden to discriminate based upon, as both a bitter comment on what he saw as the absurdity of rights legislation and a disincentive to vote for the bill. Well, it didn't work. So, joke or not, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 includes language about sex discrimination. Feminist legal scholars and activists would use that opening to advance a broader understanding of the utility of the law in addressing inequality. While hiring, promotion, and pay discrimination along gender lines were, and sadly are, important issues which feminist activists fought against, this is the same period as the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, the biggest accomplishment of feminist legal activism in this period is probably redefining the discrimination issue away from measurable discrepancies in pay and position and towards the culture of workplaces. Most importantly, the definition of sexual harassment as a form of legally actionable discrimination. This was first established by Court Precedent in 1976 and written into the EEOC guidelines in 1980, and with it, the concept of the hostile work environment, once a feminist theoretical construct, became a legally actionable category of law. All made possible, in some small backwards way, to a bigoted congressman trolling his colleagues. The battle to get sexual harassment recognized as a form of workplace discrimination, and thus a violation of civil rights law, was a long and arduous one. And while formal recognition has been extended these last 30 years, nobody seriously could consider the issue of harassment settled. As with other areas of civil rights law, the powers that be made a clear normative judgment that harassment is discrimination, but did not make clear what companies and other bodies potentially liable to discrimination lawsuits had to do in order to be compliant with this new mandate. Once again, the profession of human resources was there to fill the gap. HR professionals, as before, took the initiative with their respective organizations to establish procedures to deal with harassment complaints. These procedures, if the pattern held, would go on to become legally recognized best practices, which if followed would act to shield employers from potential liability. As with racial discrimination, the first tool HR brought to bear on the problem of sexual harassment was the in-house grievance procedure, which was adapted from procedures meant to defuse labor disputes. By and by, though, it became clear that these tools alone would not be sufficient for an environment where the internal power dynamics, or at any rate those dynamics that ran along the legally actionable dimensions of civil rights law, and the behaviors and atmospheres those dynamics create, were now the subject of actionable scrutiny. Activists and HR professionals alike, many of whom, after all, were produced by the same universities, which were often facing similar problems, pointed to the same sorts of problems we can probably all see with an internal grievance-based set of procedures. What sort of chance would a plaintiff have for her complaint to be taken seriously if the same sorts of people, sometimes the same exact people, who produce the unsafe work environment, were the ones considering her grievance? Especially as the concept of the hostile work environment, brought in to include not just sexual, but racial and eventually other forms of discrimination, the insufficiencies of a grievance-based approach became ever clearer to HR people, activists, presumably the general public alike. Something like an answer, or at least as far as the HR profession was concerned, came due to a case argued before the Supreme Court in 1998, Farragher versus City of Boca Raton. There are a number of ins and outs to this case, and I'm certainly not any lawyer, but the upshot of it was that it was determined that employers have a responsibility to proactively prevent the creation of hostile work environments, and that they face potential discrimination lawsuits if they do not. Once again, the courts created a mandate which the human resources profession was poised to fill. The way to shield companies from lawsuits in a situation where liability could literally be distilled out of the noxious cultural atmospheres in many, perhaps most, perhaps all workplaces, was to allow human resources professionals to create a less hazardous cultural environment through the training of employees. This process would begin when an employee entered the firm and would be periodically reinforced by training throughout the employee's time at the company, both to prevent recidivism and because from an HR perspective, what legally constitutes actionable harassment is a moving target. One way of looking at it is that, in essence, human resources departments and companies across the land use open-ended legal decisions about civil rights law to place themselves in positions where they would be charged with producing and periodically reproducing employees whose conduct would be conducive to a safe working environment, or put more accurately, whose possible misconduct would not be a legal liability for their employers. In a clear adaptation of radical practice, in this instance, the consciousness raising session, a concept popularized by feminists in the 60s and 70s, the preferred tool for this production came to be the harassment workshop. Though in a notable deviation from feminist practice, these workshops were typically mandatory and were led and orchestrated by paid professionals. Given what could generously be called the quaint patchwork quality of the coverage of law and power in this country, not everyone has attended such a workshop. Indeed, in the half-dozen odd jobs I've held before being a grad student, including some for big companies, I attended none. At best, signing a form somewhere that I read a sheet of paper telling me to keep my conduct appropriate. God knows some of those workplaces could have used some very thorough policing of how people behaved indeed. More generally, though, I think it's exactly the patchwork, interstitial, cheesecloth-like quality of organizational life in contemporary America that has made the convergence between post-60s radical ideas and post-civil rights management practice both possible and increasingly relevant. Given the lack of viable alternatives, like any really broadly based leftist organization, grassroots pedagogy now stands at the center of anything even vaguely progressive, to such an extent that there is little else visible there. The old joke about it being easier to dissolve and then elect a new people, rather than to do the same to the government, old Bertolt Brecht line, has actually become true. The logic of social justice discourse is precisely the logic of producing a population capable of living according to their truths, and undertaking this production in really suboptimal conditions. The task, the management of conduct with reference to a constant but somewhat unstable set of moral/legal imperatives, the means, the pedagogy of small groups, where one happens to find them, and the context, spiraling inequality and seemingly no way out. These are the things that the social justice community and the contemporary human resources profession share. And I think the two gestated long enough in similar circumstances that it is not always clear, from the perspective of the history of ideas, where the dividing line is. Perhaps it makes sense to speak of them as a single modality, which is actually just a fancy word to mean a bundle of ideas and practices. Modality, bundle of ideas and practices, just a fancy word that we throw around in history to feel special. The central concern of this modality is the management of moral space in a situation where the source of oppression, and consequently of harm, is understood as coming both from unaccountable power, which is to say from above, and from its internalization of this oppression on the part of those below. The activist, in theory, seeks to end this situation by dismantling and/or redistributing power. The manager, in theory, seeks to manage the situation to avoid liability. That's an important difference, but it's an open question how much these differences of intent matter as far as the articulation of this mode of thought and practice in the world are concerned, or even how different they really are. HR managers are people, after all, and some undoubtedly really believe that what they're doing advances social justice, or that they're making the best of the situation that they're in, etc., etc. While social justice activists typically look down upon capitalism, they often look down just as much on anti-capitalists if you read their writings, especially considering that the history of the movement, and the history of the movement tells itself, heavily involves remembrance of racism, sexism, and other perfidies on the part of socialists, communists, and others who would overturn management's apple cart once and for all, whether or not said apple cart is run by people invested in all the best anti-oppressive causes or not. So, where does this leave us? And more importantly for this long-suffering audience, what on earth has it got to do with the Beyonce dust-up with which I began this lecture? First, an important late development in the story of the social justice modality is a migration of the locus point of its discourse, away from universities and small activist groups typically generated from marginalized communities, though of course it's still present there, and towards loosely knit, informal internet communities, or what could just be called the internet. This migration was spurred by the way the internet makes communication easier in both a positive and a negative sense. It enables the sharing of ideas between social justice proponents, but also brought about an explosion in rampant public displays of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and just general shittiness that the anonymity and playground ethics prevailing on much of the internet allows and accelerates. Especially given the time of the internet's early development, the 90s, where basic politeness was treated as politically correct malarkey, the reactionary jingoism of the Bush years, the explosion of open racism with the election of Obama, it makes sense that many young people would be repulsed and would search for ideas and practices that promise not only to end the isms, but would place that combat at or near the center of moral existence. This shift in the locus of discourse led to some important changes in the way social justice understands the relationship between pedagogy and the moral imperative. Let me use an ecclesiastical metaphor here. The model of pedagogy that obtains in the formal institutional expressions of anti-discrimination, the harassment policy compliance workshop, for example, could be said to operate under a Presbyterian model. A group of people whose job it is to parse out the implications of a legal/moral imperative, be it that of social justice, that of compliance with anti-discrimination law, or that of an angry Scots god, pass on the word to their respective flocks, and the flocks toe the line, or else the individual members of the flock are out of the congregation and or the job. This functions to keep the community as a whole on the right side of the ineffable workings of grace and or discrimination law. What obtains on the internet and in other more loosely regulated moral communities could be called a congregational model. The community attempts to steer itself into the port of grace, understood in the Christian or social justice sense, and is in the end only accountable to itself and to the demands of a moral standard, which, say what one will about it, also makes much of its own intentional difficulty and lack of comfort. Anyone can theoretically lead the congregation if it has a leader at all, but anyone, leader or not, could also be given the boot by popular consensus if they threaten the delicate effort to build a righteous community. One trait the more freewheeling internet social justice proponents share with their more staid cousins in managerial professions is that both concern themselves with visible signs of potential liability and or internalized oppressive attitudes. I think this, along with the fact that people just like talking about celebrities, helps explain why moral/political dissections of pop culture artifacts and further dissections of the dissections and dissections of the dissections of the dissections ad nauseum have taken on the importance they have in social justice circles. Your attitudes to the pop stars of today can be read as visible signs of your relationship to an overwhelming and difficult to question moral imperative. If this is the case, and if your relationship to the imperative makes up part of the moral space in which we all answer to that imperative, then naturally, concerned parties might be less than restrained in attempting to manage your choices and your conduct, and will have vastly differing ideas of how this management should go to boot. It's not like there's a central authority running these things. So, what good can come out of thinking about social justice as a modality of management? For me, I tend to think of it in simple historical terms that might advance our notions of how the history of ideas work. That's what these lectures are meant to be in aid of. But, both pursuant to that, and maybe to throw out some bone of judgment to my patient audience, let me say this. We need to think seriously about the implications of using a morality in the place of a politics. Morality and politics don't exist except with reference to each other. Morality gives politics a purpose. Politics is needed to figure out how to apply oneself to this purpose in a world where morality does not always prevail, and you need to interact with people who don't necessarily share the same morality. Even if it's purely in an oppositional sense, you need to figure out how to eventually do in these people who don't share your morality, or possibly cooperate with them. That's up to you. The political theorists don't make a judgment on that. They don't, typically. Social justice discourse uses the techniques developed between activists, academics, and bureaucrats attempting to wrestle with the moral and legal dimensions of social change as its political theory implicitly. When politics becomes solely a question of the possession of moral legitimacy, then when presented with a situation that demands unified action in situations of crisis, what you get instead is infinite regression. Debate, over the debate, over who can say what, decides the deciders on any of these individual questions. Stained as they are by association with oppressors past, most political theories can be, if the interlocutor so chooses, dismissed out of hand, in favor of referring once again to the moral principles of anti-oppression, thereby surrendering many of the potential ways out of this loop, while further reassuring the interlocutor of their own moral probity. Given the long relationship between activist and legal bureaucratic methods of dealing with the politics of diversity, and given their history of sharing metaphors and practices amongst themselves, I think, in the vacuum of a conscious political theory, the politics of the management of moral space that was developed by human resources will continue to act in a political theory's place within the social justice community. In the spirit of community self-definition that motivates, rightly, so much of social justice discourse, I leave it to the listeners themselves to decide whether this is a satisfactory state of affairs.